Today we're going to talk about a book that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2025 this year, and that book is Flashlight by Susan Choi. This book follows the story of the main character, Louisa, and her family. What happens is one night, Louisa and her father, they go for a walk on the beach by the breakwater. It's getting to be dusk and dark outside. Louisa's 10, her father has a flashlight, and he cannot swim. And later that night, Louisa is found on the beach, laying in the surf, half in the beach, half in the water, soaked to the bone, and her father is nowhere to be found. They think he drowned. No one really puts too much effort into investigating anything. It seems to the police of the time that it was pretty cut and dry. Like, he just drowned in the water. And Louisa doesn't really have memory of it. It seems like she was in shock. And at that time, she went to the hospital. She was there for a few days. And when she starts to come out of it, at first she had said that her father was kidnapped. But then later, I don't know how much later, she's like, I never said that. That's not true. So her memory, and she would just make up stories. It seemed like she never had the same story of what actually happened. Like she would say, oh, I hit my head and then I fell. And it's like, oh, you hit your head on the beach? What? There's just sky above you. There's nothing there. Like you maybe fell and hit your head. And then she'd be like, oh yeah, that's what happened. So she changed her story all the time. She didn't really remember. I think a lot of it could have been shock. And so this story is what happened to her father. You get into her mother and father stories, like where her dad grew up, when he grew up in Japan, when he was younger, it was in the 1940s. And he didn't even know for the first part of his life that he was Korean, because when his family escaped from Korea when the war was going on and came to Japan, they had to pretend they were Japanese. And so like the kid thought he was Japanese this whole time. So when the war ends and he finds out Korean, he's like, what? So in this too, there's like that whole sense of identity, where you're from, your homeland, stuff like that. And then eventually the father moves to the US, marries a white woman, Anne, and they have their daughter Louisa. And so Louisa never really quite feels like she fits in one place or another until one day they actually go to Japan. And so the story, it moves between the post-war Korean immigrant community in Japan to suburban America and the North Korean regime to tell an astonishing story of family that got swept up in the tides of the 20th century. It's such a entrancing and intense and sad, emotional journey of growth and resentment and so many things. Like, so growing up, Louisa always felt a little weird because she looked a little different from her schoolmates when going to school in the US. And then for Cirque's job, her father, they end up going to Japan for a year. He's going to teach there, and then they move there. And then her mother at that time starts to become ill. Like, she didn't know what she had, but she had MS, and the MS is starting to develop where at some point she will end up in a wheelchair. And then you get into the backstory of her mother too, who she had prior gotten pregnant by this spiritual guru guy who was married, and then she ended up having to give up the baby that she had, and then the man ended up taking it, and him and his wife raised the kid Tobias, and then Anne and Tobias will connect later in life in Japan. So there's a lot of like weird crisscrossing of the globe and just the stories of each individual and how they grew up and then came to come together, and what happens when the father goes missing. And so before he goes missing, Louisa, she comes to Japan and she goes to the school there, and she doesn't go to like I don't know what you would call it, like a foreign national school or anything. She just goes to the Japanese school. And at first she doesn't really like it because, she doesn't speak the language, and she doesn't know how to do all the different things they do. But soon she picks up on all of that. She starts to have friends, and she starts to feel like more so she fits there than in other places. And at the same time, like, she gets angry at her mother because if she goes out with her mother, it's very noticeable. People stare at her because her mom's this like skinny, tall, blonde woman. And then, then she's like almost embarrassed that people know that she's not fully Asian or in that respect. And so I think she has a crisis of identity through most of this, and she has a lot of anger towards her mother throughout the whole thing. She's very argumentative and angry and just holds a grudge. I don't know that Anne helps anything, but I don't really know what Anne could have done better to make their relationship better. Especially just like having those traumatic events that happened to the daughter so early on in her life. It's a beautiful and sad and bittersweet story. There are a lot of like time gaps where you're just left to imagine what happens, because all of a sudden you'll be in a chapter and it jumps ahead 10 years, but it's never bad. Like, I don't feel like those gaps in between really needed to be filled in. Like, you get enough to know like where it should be. Otherwise, I feel like maybe the book would have been a little unnecessarily long. The writing is absolutely gripping. It took me a little bit to get into it. You experience all the things and the hardships that the characters go through, especially Cirque, when you do find out what happened to him, and then you do see where he went and was held, and that he was actually kidnapped, and there's all of that story, and you get into that, which is disturbing. And then you find out later too that all these coastal communities in Japan had people gone missing over the years, and no one ever connected them together till way later on in life. And for all those years, you know, Louisa thought her father was dead. So does she ever find out that he didn't die? Does she ever find him again? Does Anne ever get to know that he didn't die and maybe he might still be out there? Well, you got to read it to find out. And I thought it was an absolutely well done story that is historical fiction. The writing is fantastic. Maybe some people will be a little put off by the weird time gaps, but I don't think it was an issue. At least it wasn't for me. And for the most part, you're able to get the gist of what happened in between. Sometimes I have weird relationships with Booker List Prize. Like, either I really seem to dislike them or I really like them. And this one fell into that I really liked it. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check it out. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And if you enjoyed hanging out today, hit that subscribe button, come back, see me again, and we'll talk about more bookish things and weird stuff.